Hi, and welcome to another Monday Moment in Matthew. I'm so glad you've joined us again this week as we begin to look at the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. Just briefly to recap, over the last several weeks, we've been looking at what we call the preparation of Jesus. We've seen his birth, his lineage, the events surrounding his birth, and the events of his first 30 years of life, really, that have been preparing him for his ministry. As we ended last week, we saw that Jesus began his ministry in the land of Galilee, the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, and that there were great crowds that were coming around him because of the impact and effect that he had on those. Now, today we start what's going to be several weeks going through the Sermon on the Mount, where we look at a situation in which Jesus is presented with an opportunity to speak to several followers, this great crowd that has arisen around him, and that he can impart some wisdom on them. So I'll invite you to read along with us now, Matthew 5, verses 1 through 12. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So, as we're looking at Matthew chapter 5, I want to start by looking at the Sermon on the Mount in a little bit of a different perspective. I think we can easily define the entire sermon as a sermon on attitudes. And I want you to pay careful attention as we go throughout the sermon. Jesus is going to be speaking to a group of people that should have some knowledge on how they need to be interacting with God, how they need to be with each other, how they need to be towards those in power, those that are not the same as them, those that are the same as them. And throughout it, Jesus has to teach them how to properly define their attitude through it. There's a lot of issues amongst the children of the Jewish nation at this time. They're not being the people they should be. They're all about self and not about God or about others. And Christ is teaching on that throughout this sermon. And so when we look at the Sermon on the Mount, we can break it up in several different categories. But we need to understand that the key part of the message is that their hearts be right with God. And if their hearts are right with God, that will determine how they interact with each other. And if they're interacting with each other properly, then there's not going to be such issues like murder, like adultery, like divorce, etc. If they only treated each other as they should, and if they only loved God properly and had their hearts centered correctly on God, then there would be none of these issues that he has to talk about. They wouldn't need to learn how to pray. They would know how to communicate with God. They wouldn't need to know how to present themselves under a fast. They would properly have that relationship with God. They wouldn't need to understand why not to worry, why not to be anxious, what type of foundation to build on, etc., if they had their heart right with God. And that's really how Jesus starts this sermon. We first get a little bit of information. In verse 1, it says that he sees the crowd, and so he goes up on this mountain to speak to them. And so this is just setting the scene of what's going to be a long discourse. It's going to span over 3 chapters in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew records a great deal of detail about Jesus' teaching here, and it's important to note what he says and how Matthew groups it together. He starts with what we call the Beatitudes. And it's very interesting to note that the Beatitudes are bookended with the idea of inheriting the kingdom of heaven. It starts with, blessed are those who are poor in spirit, and blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, and both will inherit the kingdom of heaven. And then throughout the other Beatitudes, Each of them is dealing with a different part of our attitude. How we interact with others, how we interact towards God, and how we interact with ourselves. What do we consider of ourselves? Are we elevating ourselves to a high place? Or are we placing ourselves properly under the mindset of who we are in the grand scheme of things in relation to God, in relation to our religious leaders? And so when we look at these a little bit further, let's just notice them. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. And blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And so what we have is not a list that we need to determine which 2 or 3 we're going to try to accomplish in our life. We should be striving to obtain all of these attitudes. This is talking about the proper person, the one who would inherit the kingdom of heaven, the one who is going to be persecuted for righteousness' sake, the one who is going to receive all these blessings. You see, by developing our attitude into one that is in service to God, by conditioning ourselves to be faithful to God and understand what He expects of us and how we need to interact with each other, then we receive the blessings of God. And these are far greater blessings than anything here on earth can promise. You know, if we're hungry, if we're thirsty, there is nothing better than being satisfied. You know, it's not just that we have our thirst quenched or we have our hunger quenched. The idea of satisfied is the idea of being filled without any need for more. God is able to do for us far greater than anyone on earth can, but we have to strive to attain to all of these different aspects that design our true attitude, and that is a heart that is centered on God. Christ makes a big point here in his sermon about talking about those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, and he compares that in verse 12 to being joyful, to being glad, because your reward in heaven is great. And you think, okay, persecution on earth, great reward in heaven. Okay, that sounds pretty good. But the thing that always sits out to me here is for they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Now, let's think about this for just a moment. In the last 30 years or so, there is really only a few prophet or prophetesses we have in Scripture. Matter of fact, for the last 400 years, we have a period of what's called silence. God has not been speaking to his people. God has been pretty silent up until the time period of the Christ. We have a lady named Anna, we learn in the book of Luke, who is a prophetess. We have John the Baptist, who is a prophet. And we have Jesus, who is a prophet. But we don't actually have many individuals, especially those who we have recordings of them being persecuted by the people. So who is Jesus talking about? Well, if we go back to the Old Testament, we have plenty records of prophets who were put to death by kings and queens and by the Jews and by even foreign nations. We have tons of situations in which the prophets were not respected. And what a prophet is a messenger from God. Here's what Jesus is saying. Those who are contrary to the will of God, those who are in the world and of the world, will persecute you for righteousness' sake. Christ is not saying that the people who are physically present are the ones who did all this to the prophets years ago. He is referring to their history and how they are no different than their former ancestors. And it's funny because when you look through the prophets, you look at the book of Zechariah, that's one of the key points of the book of Zechariah is to not be like your fathers, not be like your ancestors and what they did towards God and his people. And as we go throughout the Jewish message, as we go throughout this gospel to them, Matthew is going to show Christ's teaching periodically through that and how they're no different than the times of Isaiah, in which they were not listening to God. They were not attuning themselves to God. And so that's what Christ is saying here. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. The world is going to do this to you. Those who would not bring their attitude in subjection to God are going to be upset with you and persecute you for doing so. And that's being persecuted for righteousness' sake. It's for having the attitude that is set on God, not on self, not on the world, but having an attitude that is set on God and individuals putting you down for doing that. It is not for our own personal beliefs. It is not for our own personal opinions. It is for an attitude that develops all of these characteristics throughout the Beatitudes and is set on God. That is who Christ is trying to get these people to become and who we need to become today. And he's going to stress that further next week when we look at the idea of salt and light of the world. I hope you'll join us again next week. Matthew 5:13-16 are some of my favorite verses to talk about. Often when we think about the word light, I just want to give you a little blurb for next week. Often when we think of the word light from the gospel message, we go to the Gospel of John. That's where we typically go to see how Christ is depicted as the light of the world. But did you know that the word darkness is used more in the Gospel of Matthew than in the other gospel accounts? And that Matthew uses the word light almost as many times as John? And we're going to see a very key part of that message next week when we look at Matthew 5:13-16. So I hope you come back and join us again, and I hope you'll have a great rest of your week. Thank you for joining us.